All right, so welcome to the second online session of the fall 2024 series of this AI Security and Defense Forum. This is very much a collaborative initiative with support from SINTEF using the basic research funding from the Research Council of Norway, from these alumni clubs across France, Germany, and Norway, and various faculty members and staff at MIT. And today, what we'll do is to do also a quick recap of what we have been doing since spring 2024, and a recap of the key discussion we had with Gabriela Bridges at her session yesterday. And then we will go on with we will start the formal presentation at 3:20 Paris time. And then we will end up with a little bit of closing, Q&A before closing. But for those who want to ask questions, please type in the questions in the QA interface, and then Noreen and Olivia will fill in the questions towards the end for John-Mikal. So just a quick recap and the overview of this AISD Forum. One of the key motivation here is that the field of AI and global geopolitics are two fast-changing areas, and they have become, in a way, inescapable from one another and are both having profound impacts on our lives. And when we look at the investments and effort put into basic research or AI research, applied research. Here we have some statistics from AI research. And if we just look at the sheer scale difference of what you have in democratic countries compared to autocratic countries, you see a significant gap in the number of work that's been produced over the past few years. At the very bottom, you have just one institution from the democratic countries, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and this is still very much lagging behind the rest of the 9 institutions ahead of us. So this forum is intended to be a to curate content, interesting content coming from PhD students, young professors, or people out in the field, coming from either AI, ML, or people who are in security studies. So we want to open source this learning process. So we want to, we identify the speakers, we host online seminars, and we want to be able to expand beyond our immediate professional and social circle to be able to draw in more participation. And so a quick overview of what we hosted in spring 2024. These sessions, 8 sessions fall broadly into 4 categories. One is in the space of information science, where we had Tom Soru from Serendipity AI showing us his LLM-based pipeline apply on extracting top trends from public media. And then we have Antonio Longa from University of Trento showing us a novel method of generating synthetic temporal network data using taking a more egocentric perspective on the graph. And then we have Professor Giole Zardini from MIT showing us a fairly comprehensive framework with primitives of system design, which focuses a lot on compositionality, which he now uses to design Formula One cars. And then we also additionally look at other game theory methods in terms of designing, planning the surveys, planning the patrolling efforts of, say, wildlife protection in Africa, or surveying for unidentified vessels in the coastal area for drug enforcement. We then also look at some of the emerging capabilities of large language models applied to here through meta research. And here we have the PhD student from MIT CSAIL, Athol Jacob. He showed us how they apply LLM to play this game of diplomacy, which actually requires fairly involved negotiation with other players. And then we look at LLM's application on program search. And program search is used to say, help you optimize your code, your math equations. And this is, again, LLM driven. And lastly, we look at some of the field work that's been done in the front lines of Ukraine by Evan Pla from Zero Line, primarily looking at some of the gaps, some of the gaps that emerge through the usage of drones in the battlefield, and how to bridge that gap with the larger information system that's being proposed by NATO and other countries. So that is because the state of warfare has changed very quickly since the full invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. And Zero Line provides us some insight on what the future information system might look like for managing the battlefield. And the last one is the study of propaganda, the Russian propaganda throughout this past 2 years, done by John Rosenbeck. So you can find the information on our website. And now here we will have a quick recap on yesterday's session with Gabriela Gracious. Olivia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a co-organizer of the speaker series with Phil, and I am a doctoral candidate at MIT who works on NATO and the Arctic. So yesterday we had a wonderful presentation from Gabriela Gracious, who is a research associate at the Arctic Institute and is an expert in Arctic security. I also highly recommend looking at her website because she is just a prolific writer on Arctic security studies, ontological security studies, and commenting on a lot of foreign policy issues right now. So highly recommend. So entitled Pipeline, Cyber Ops, and Disinfo, Hybrid Warfare in the Arctic, Gabriela introduced us to two concepts, gray zone warfare and hybrid threat, both of which have proven very tough to respond to. So a quick overview of these definitions: gray zone warfare encompasses illegal activities that are below the threshold of armed organized violence and range from political subversion to the abuse of legal process. And then hybrid threat is one that mixes conventional, irregular, and asymmetrical activities and can range from cyber attacks to the manipulation of international law and economic pressure. I also highly suggest this information is coming from a report that she co-authored that you can find on her website. And if you're interested in this issue, I highly suggest going and finding it. I think it's from the European Leadership Network. So her big question in discussing these kinds of threats yesterday is that, in her words, if we have trouble attributing blame to an actor, how should we deter against threats or signal to our adversaries that we don't find this acceptable? And so she then explained the uniqueness of the Arctic environment as a threat landscape, highlighting the long distances and the extreme weather, and factors in these kind of threat equations. And she set up 4 threats in the Arctic now that she kind of walked us through: hacking and cyber, disinformation, physical interference, and energy intimidation. And she focused her presentation on 2 actors, Russia and China. So in her, as she explained it, Russia is a malign actor whose goals are projecting power, legitimizing its behavior and shoring up sovereignty claims in the region. But since Russia has so much investment in oil and gas in the Arctic, it does not want to bring formal war to the region, and so thus hybrid warfare is a means to reach its aims. And then China is an actor that wants a foothold outside of the Indo-Pacific, and one of these areas is in the Arctic. And so then Gabriella walked us through a series of threats and case studies from GPS jamming during the 2018 Trident Juncture exercises in Norway to an undersea cable being cut in 2022 in the Svalbard archipelago. So I would love to go through all of them, but I can't. So again, highly recommend you read that report. But we also had some very interesting and thoughtful questions at the end of her presentation, which included subjects like if larger public perceptions of the Arctic, for example, its frozenness, its, people perceiving it to be uninhabited, how does that impact larger threat assessments? And then we also had a very interesting conversation about non-Arctic actors and their interests in the region. So from the BRICS countries setting up a possible research statement in Svalbard to Singapore. So overall, this was just such a fantastic inaugural presentation for our series, as Gabriella was able to do three things. First, she gave us an understanding of the Arctic as a unique and particular operating environment, one that we really should be looking at if we're thinking about kind of future innovation and in the future geopolitics. And this technological understanding of the region is really going to be a through line throughout our series in this fall. Second, she connected two actors' intentions to the region to larger geopolitical issues because the Arctic is connected to the larger kind of global landscape, and it's important that we realize that. And then she just gave us a lot to think about. So I really want to thank you all for being here. Please go look up her stuff and enjoy the presentation today.
Great. Thank you, Olivia. All right, so we will just start with the introduction of today's session now. So John-Mikal Størdal is a familiar name to a lot of you who work in the security and defense sector, because John-Mikal had been the Director General of FFI, which is the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment in Norway, up until 2012. Since then, he has been directing the Collaboration Support Office of the Science and Technology Organization at NATO, based in Paris. And John-Mikal actually is also an alum of MIT. He graduated with a master's degree in aeroastro, which is aeronautics and aerospace engineering. And he has also a master's degree of computer science and engineering from NTNU in Norway. And he also sits on several boards, which includes the various NATO Science and Technology Board and European Defense Agency Research and Technology Steering Board. So, and before we get there, I would also have Frederic, who is the president of the Alumni Club in France, to give us a few words on this whole, how this whole thing came about.
Thank you, Phil. So the MIT Club of France is, the club that gather all alumni, around 1,800 in France. We are facilitating the MIT representation, in France, and we are making the liaison between France and Boston, as much as we're also doing the fabric between the alumni to keep community alive as if we were on campus team. We believe there's a big expectation, and we want to congratulate you for this series of events. I think it's a big expectation in France for this type of worldwide vision effort that only MIT can bring, and that is also lasting in time. You've made a significant effort in making a series of events, which allow to keep the focus and the attention level and cover a lot of ground. And also you're bringing the MIT excellence in it, which is a great guarantee. We may even think that this may evolve later in virtual working groups when the community get really strong and there are ties between between the groups. So John-Mikal is working in France since 2021. So he's a member of the MIT Club of France, and we're really proud and grateful that he accepted to participate and give us this high-level vision that we need, mixing technology, geostrategy, and sovereignty. So this is a very. We wanted to thank you all in the name of the French alumni for doing that. I forgot to mention, we're also proud that this is a first that I know of alliance between 3 MIT clubs with Germany that we like very much, and Norway, whose president you are, and we hope that's going to be the beginning of a long trend. Thank you to all. Did you hear me? Hello?
Hello? Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Did you hear the introduction, or you didn't hear the introduction?
I heard it loud and clear. Thanks. Could you please bring up the presentation? So when that's taking place, good morning to people in North America, and good afternoon to our European colleagues. And I'm very happy to be here and presenting to you today. It's a great honor from Paris. Also to our German colleagues, happy Unification Day. As you might be aware, it's a public holiday in Germany today, celebrating the reunification back in 1990. So it's a historic day. What I'm going to talk about today is the importance of science and technology and the work you do developing science and technology. And in my opinion, it's more important now than in a very, very long time. And if also time permits, I will speak a little bit about the NATO Science and Technology Organization, what we do, and what our aim is. But before I dig into that, some context. And this is a personal perspective. I do think when people, let's say 100 years from now into the future, when they look back at this time in history, I think they will see it as a time of major change, equivalent to the, let's say, end of the Cold War that we saw back in 1990, the end of the Second World War. It is also a time of huge uncertainty about the future. And I think we have to accept that the world of the past, let's say 5 to 10 years ago, will not come back. And this is a mindset change. And we have to act according to the world the way it is, and not to the world the way we would like it to be. And NATO plays a key role in this. And for those of you not so familiar with NATO, just a few words. The North Atlantic Treaty, which is the background for NATO, was written and agreed back in 1949. And some of you might have heard about Article 5. And this is the article in the treaty that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. So it's a one for all for one type of approach. But this is, of course, the most important thing. But the treaty, and I encourage you to read it, it will take you only 5 minutes. They were good at writing short back then. And the real purpose of NATO is to safeguard the freedom and the security of its members. And it's about preserving peace, security, and prosperity in both North America and Europe. And when I'm traveling around and meet people and they ask me what I'm doing, now I'm introducing myself as working in an international peace organization. It's also the most successful alliance in known history. When it was founded, it had 12 members. Now it has 32. And is also, with its 75 years, we are celebrating this year, it's the alliance that has lasted the longest time. I've heard that in ancient Greek, they had a similar alliance, but now it has been outlasted by NATO. And my last point is also in NATO, it's a very definite political dimension. It's also a clearly military dimension. But somewhere behind the scenes, there is also what I would call a third dimension, and that's the science and technology. And science and technology cooperation within NATO has taken place since 1952. So we have been around more or less as long as NATO has existed. And the reason for this is that advantage in science and technology was seen back then and seen now as fundamental to the success of NATO in reaching its goals. And also from a NATO perspective, right now, our values, our security, our freedom, our way of life are challenged by authoritarian states. So that's a little bit about the background from what I'm gonna present today. Next slide, please. So, as you are aware, science and technology has always been important in defense. And if you look back in history, disruptive technologies or technological breakthroughs have been deciding factors, all back to the longbows, to cannons, to gunpowder, and later, of course, cruise missiles, the nuclear bomb, and so on. Currently, we are experiencing what I would call a global science and technology race. You can say that, well, always we have had competition when it comes to science and technology, not least between companies. What is new now is that science and technology is part of the geopolitical agenda, and it's seen as a strategic key to power. And we have not seen this, in my opinion, in this way since the Cold War. What is also a result of this is you can find that blocks of nations, of which NATO and like-minded nations is one block, will be willing to still share a lot of science and technology knowledge, but more within the block than outside. And a recent very, I would say, good example of this is the discussion related to the production of data chips or data processing units. And you can see this as an example of how it all unfolds. Also, and related to this, of course, is that science and technology is now closely connected to national security, societal security, and also societal resilience, all of which are more important now than in a long time. But on the other hand, it's also seen as a key, science and technology, to solve the other big challenges in addition to security, like climate, energy, and health. Next slide, please. So as technology continues to alter the character of conflict, it has acquired this strategic importance. And technological primacy is increasingly influences the success on the battlefield. And I think an example following the unprovoked second and full-scale Russian attack on Ukraine, technology has played an important role on the battlefield. And a former Ukrainian chief of defense said in an interview with The Economist that he needed a technological breakthrough, one or more disruptive technologies to move ahead. And if you look at the slide, please take a look to the right and note the term Sputnik moment. This was expressed by the equivalent of the US Chief of Defense, Mike Milley, following a test flight of a Chinese hypersonic missile a year and a half ago. Next slide, please. So NATO's strategic competitors and potential adversaries are investing heavily in science and technology. And if you look at the picture coming from OECD, it shows investments in research and development in general. So it includes all investments in the countries and the union described, both civilian, military, both public and private investments. And don't dig into the numbers, it's the trend that is important. And you can see that China has been investing for a long time heavily in science and technology. And in my opinion, we do have a Sputnik moment once again right now. And for those of you not fully familiar with the term Sputnik moment, this is a term describing the shock waves the then Soviet Union back in 1957 sent through NATO nations when they launched the first ever satellite into orbit. This was a major, let's say, wake-up call, showing, at least it was perceived, as if the Soviet Union back then was far ahead in technology than the NATO nations, and especially in the US. The US took swift action back then. And just to give a few examples, NASA, the Space Administration, was founded the year after. DARPA, the Defense Research Agency that has been, was the, let's say, the brain behind both Internet and the Global Positioning System, was founded the year after. We have MITRE, which is let's say, a think tank and delivering results to the US DoD. And since this is a MIT community, I have read somewhere that MITRE is an abbreviation of MIT Research and Engineering. If some of you can confirm that, that would be great. But anyway, MIT played a key role in responding to this Sputnik moment in the US. But it was wider than that. It also influenced a lot of recruitment to the STEM subject, science, technology, engineering, and math. It also made the US look into its education system. And later, more of the same trends was then seen in Europe, not least thanks to the OECD organization that focused on how to make research and development more efficient in the European nations. So in my opinion, we do see things similar to this right now. It's not so obvious. We do not have this satellite up there shining, but there are similarities. We see that our technological advantage is challenged. We must have more people recruitment into the STEM subjects, and we see the increased importance of science and technology. On the other hand, the science and technology landscape has changed a lot since the 50s and 60s. And just to give an example, a significant amount of the research and development investment takes place now in the civilian sector. I think somewhere in 1960, the US Department of Defense investment in military R&D was something like one third of all investment in R&D in total in the world. Currently, they still invest a lot, but now it's in the, let's say, 4 to 5% of the total investment in R&D in the world. Another big shift that we have also seen in Ukraine is big tech's role. Many of the big tech companies invest in R&D more money than most NATO nations. And they are also playing a role, increasing role in conflict and war. So in Ukraine, we have seen Starlink, we have seen Microsoft, Google, and so on play important role in the support for Ukraine first and foremost. And also adding to this, we see there is a report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute recently, and their critical technology tracker, and they follow closely the global race for future power based on science and technology. And in their latest report, they concluded that China's global lead is in 37 out of 44 critical technologies going forward. This includes defense, space, robotics, energy, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and we saw also the slides early on in this presentation. So this is also one of the reasons why, my personal opinion, we do have this Sputnik moment again, and we need to, of course, do many of the same things that was done back then, but adapted to the new situation and today's world. Next slide, please. So why is and how is this playing out on the battlefield? And there is this very close connection that has been recognized in NATO for a long time. And it starts to the left with scientific excellence. This is what's going on in the universities and the research facilities. And built on that, we can have a technological edge, be ahead of adversaries. That again leads to military supremacy. And again, without military supremacy, we will not have deterrence. And NATO now is back, I would say, to basic. It's about deterrence. It's about preserving peace. And this, let's say, connection has been understood very well. It has disappeared for a while, but now it's back. And just to give an example, and I think to reflect on what does it mean to have a technological edge. And I was back then young student, and I watched the first Gulf War, and it was an interview with a person from Baghdad, and he had just watched a Tomahawk cruise missile coming down one of the streets and turn straight into one of the communication centers in Baghdad at the time. And he seemed to me as a normal family man in his 40s, and he was asked about all this. And he was totally shocked. He said, "This is divine. This is something I cannot understand. We cannot fight this. This is the gods coming down on us." And this is, if we suddenly wake up one day and we do not have the technological edge, this is something we have taken for granted. But waking up not having it, I think will be not a good position to be in. We have taken this for granted for too long. And if you want to have effective deterrence and defense going forward, we need to make the right decisions and investments right now. And again, there is a close connection, because what unfolded in the first Gulf War was a direct result of the Sputnik moment and the investments made back then. So here we have a fairly long-term type of approach, strategic approach. At the same time, we need to tap off and use technology quickly and bring it to the battlefield. And this is something, not least the current conflict and war in Ukraine has shown. There they talk about, let's say, the innovation loop being down to 4 weeks maybe. So new versions of weapon systems are fielded, and after 4 weeks they need to be updated some way or the other to still be effective, because the opponent will develop countermeasures. So it's both a short-term goal here, but also a long-term goal, and we need to keep both thoughts in the head at the same time. Next slide, please. And I do think all this is summed up in the latest NATO strategic concept. It was published in 2022. And after the North Atlantic Treaty I mentioned before itself, this is the most important document for NATO. And it describes very well that NATO has gone, I would say, through 3 major phases. It was deterrence, peace, preserving peace in Europe, North America, until the end of the Cold War. Then it was a period of out-of-area operations where NATO engaged around the world, still to preserve peace and democracy and freedom. But with this strategic concept for 2022, it's back to basic and the time before the Cold War ended, of course in a modernized version, tailored to the times we are living in. And it's just fun if you compare the NATO strategic document in 2022 with the last version coming from 2009. And just for fun, I counted the number of times technology was mentioned. And back in 2009, I think it was mentioned once, and not in a strategic context. In 2022, it's mentioned more than 15 times, and again as a strategic enabler for NATO. So that's why S&T now is so important, why it will, let's say, be even more important going forward. And next slide, please. And this also builds on a strategy that was published in the US back in 2020. And the reason I brought this in is just to show you what I would call the whole of society approach to this. If you look at how it's defined, the security innovation base in this strategy, it includes academia, it includes national laboratories, and it includes the private sector. And this is something new. So this is a whole of societal approach to maintain the technological edge. Next slide, please. And this general technology strategy in the US then was translated in 2023, last year, into a national defense science and technology strategy. And even with the US being the nation in NATO investing the most in military research and development, something in the order of $100 billion a year. That's a lot of money. And 6 times or 7 times the amount the total of Europe invests in military R&D. Still, the US sees the advantage of international collaboration, and I'm very proud and happy then that in this strategy, the NATO Science and Technology Organization is mentioned first among those tools in the toolbox to do international collaboration. Next slide, please. So that leads into what are we doing in this in the NATO Science and Technology Organization. So that's a framework, a collaborative framework, where we bring the best and brightest scientists and engineers in NATO nations that the nations themselves has selected and appointed, and we bring them together in a collaborative environment. So currently we have something like 5,000 scientists and engineers from the NATO and partner nations, selected and appointed by the nation, and they engage in more than 400 research activities at any time. And they are looking into solving carefully selected problems to support our armed forces. And the people, they come from industry, they come from academia, and they come from military and civilian research establishments or labs. And in addition also from the military itself and officers with a technological background or operational need. And the whole idea, what we are doing, is to multiply the investments made in the nations by bringing together and collaborate. And the one of the biggest NATO nations and also one of the most active nations in our network have calculated a return of investment of being part of our network as 10 to 1. So let's say €1 invested gives a return tenfold back. And this is the largest defense-focused S&T network in the world. And we cover a broad area of military relevant S&T fields. I know artificial intelligence, of course, is the topic of this series of presentations, but we also look at other like quantum sensors, biotechnology, and so on. And we have a special focus, I would say, of what we call disruptive technologies, meaning technologies with the potential to disrupt the battlefield in the future. And if you look back in history, and as I mentioned, we have seen many of those technologies historically that has led to this type of disruptions. And we need to be ahead so we are not surprised in this field. I also would like to use this opportunity to let's say, reflect a little bit on how the NATO nations have been reacting to the new situation that I have described. And they follow, I would say, two directions. So one is to strengthen our own technological and industrial base. That means by investing more in science and technology research and development, to strengthen also collaboration. But what we see is now it's not a, let's say, a worldwide invitation to cooperate, but more selective. And we also see an increased interest to do classified cooperation. We also see a trend that many nations are now developing their own industrial strategies for the first time than in many, many years. I mentioned the whole of society approach, so they include in their, let's say, preparation, universities, also civilian industry and so on. The term tech diplomacy has been introduced, and Denmark has been a pioneering nation in utilizing and establishing that, meaning that in their, let's say, professional diplomacy or corps of diplomats, they include technology specialists in a way that has not been done before. We also see it in, let's say, initiatives to motivate and inspire young talents to first choose the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, math, and second, also to use their talent in support of national security. And last but not least, we also see an increased emphasis on ethics in what we do. I think representing the democracies of the world, we need to be ethical, solid in all what we do. So that's initiatives to strengthen the, let's say, technological and industrial base within the NATO nations and partner nations, I would like to add. The other, let's say, approach is to better protect the knowledge we already have and also the knowledge we will develop in the future. Because we do see an increased intelligence threat, since S&T is now seen as a strategic asset. It naturally follows up with intelligence. And I can tell that from our systems here in Paris, excuse me, we see an exponential growth in the attempts to attack our systems the last 2 to 3 years. We also see increased discussions about research security. Lately, the EU published its view on research security. And of course, this is a challenge because on the one hand, you have, let's say, the DNA of development of science is based on openness, transparency, spreading the results, being challenged, and then how to balance this science tradition with national security. This is something that many nations are, let's say, approaching now, and we are discussing a lot within the NATO network about this. We also see export control coming back in a way not seen before. We see the importance of supply chains and to have security in the supply chains. Also ownership, the importance of ownership. Who is owning a company, especially related to startups? If there are startups with very promising technologies, we have to pay attention who will be the owner of these or owners of these companies going forward. And last, we also see when it comes to standardization of technology, there is now this kind of competition plays out also in this area. So just an example, last year it was an election for the chair of the International Telecommunication Union. This is part of the United Nations organization. And it was quite a race to get the right person into this chair's, the chair role, with a lot of engagement, of major engagement, I would say, not seen in this way in a long time. Yeah, so next slide, please. And last, I would just like to show what I would call a small nation approach to this. And this is based on my former role, as was mentioned, and thanks for the kind introduction to Phil and Frederick. When I was at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, or FFI, we relied heavily on international collaboration. And I'm happy to report that Norway is one of the most active nations in this community overall. And the way we looked at it, if you look on the left, we have the international collaboration when it comes to science and technology. We had a very close collaboration with the US. But then, of course, the NATO part was very important for us. So this gave us input to our nation and what we called the triple helix approach, where we brought together the users represented and also the procurement in the armed forces, together with research and development, represented here with FFI, the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, and then industry. And the output from this, as the NATO, Norway as a nation added money, we added talent, we took the risk, we had our development projects, and out of this came what you see on the right. On top, there is the anti-ship missile or family of anti-ship missiles. So it's the naval strike missile and the joint strike missile. And they have now been exported to numerous NATO nations. We also see the Black Hornet. That's a very small helicopter for surveillance, especially in urban areas. And below you find the autonomous underwater vehicle Hugin, which is also a world-leading technology. So this international cooperation made Norway as a nation capable of developing this world-leading technologies. And it not only helped to modernize our armed forces, but it was also recognized as burden sharing back into the alliance when we could offer this to the other nations. And just to illustrate the result of this, I just learned some days ago that currently now Norway is the third largest exporter of military equipment to the United States Armed Forces. And this has been a development, let's say, from the last 30, 40 years. We were not there, let's say, 30 years ago. And this is working on this model in a systematic way. So, conscious of time, I stop there and I'm open and happy to take any questions or comments. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so we are going to start the Q&A now. So I just want to thank John-Mikal for a very comprehensive, thorough, and interesting presentation. And I'm sure everyone has a ton of questions. So as you think of them, please put them in the Q&A box and I will kind of get to them chronologically. So the first question I would like to ask kind of is related to one of the first questions in the Q&A box. So what I want to ask is, we have some people, including myself, who are either still in school or are early in their career in kind of science and technology spaces. What would be your advice for someone who would want to work within the fields of science and technology in conjunction with NATO? And are there some steps that we can take now to kind of prepare us for kind of stepping into those roles in the future?
Thanks. Yes, I'm very happy to take that question. So first, all scientists and engineers going into our network are vetted in their respective nations. That said, we last year, and this is a recent initiative, we have had summer schools for early career scientists and engineers. So this year we tried it as a pilot. So we had one in Germany and we had one in Finland. I attended the one in Finland, and I can tell you we had many more applicants than we had available spaces, and they focused specifically on electronic warfare. And this was, I felt, really very inspiring and motivating meeting among, let's say, more experienced scientists from our network being together with these young early career scientists. So my advice would be, if you would like to explore what we can offer, please send us an email. I have the address on the last slide. I can bring it up in a minute. And we will then direct you to your national coordinator or your national office that kind of takes care of all your nation's participation in our network. So now we have the early career scientist events. Also, I would like to mention last year we had the Women and Girls in Science that was published on NATO's homepage. It was an invitation to early career female scientists and engineers, and they were invited to present some ideas on giving topics. I personally had the opportunity to attend the final. It was in headquarters in NATO in April, and the 16 finalists, they were then presenting. And among those 16, we had a selection of 3 winners, and they were invited, among other things, to the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. in July this year. So there are many opportunities, I would say, and more to come. But again, please contact us. We will direct you into your nation's points of contact.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that email address should be in the chat right now. So I have a question that is similar to this. It's from Dags Olsteins, and they ask, a portion of university students in the West appear to be adverse to collaboration with the military industry. Does this already have a notable effect in attracting talent in dual use and military R&D? And is there an influence from hostile intelligence operations in shaping opinion? And can communication be improved to remedy this?
Thanks for a very good question. And if I understood correctly, the first part was that a lot of university students are reluctant to work in defense.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So what we see there is, and I'm not an expert in all nations, of course, but we do see huge differences between the nations. So I can start with my home country, Norway, where, let's say, the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment have been among the top 10 most popular places to be for scientists and engineers. I know that in other nations, what you present is definitely a challenge. And I had the opportunity to, some years ago before COVID, I had lunch with some early career scientists that was attending a meeting. And they came from a NATO nations, and they told me that they would not dare tell their friends that they had been to this NATO conference. So there is a huge, let's say, difference between the nations. What we do see now, and as a trend, and especially following, let's say, the development I have described, we see that working to support the freedom, peace, and security in NATO nations are more popular than it used to be. And we do see an increased interest from especially early career scientists to be part of our community and to contribute. So I think the trend is changing. Of course, there will be reluctance. But again, it's, for me, we need to communicate the message that this is not about war. It's about keeping peace, preserving peace and prosperity. And we can definitely be much better in doing that. If there are, let's say, influence on this, we have the term called cognitive warfare, which means, let's say, how adversaries tries to influence the minds of people in NATO nations, and this is an ongoing effort. And I think also earlier presentations in this series has kind of presented this. And I definitely, without, let's say, knowing all the details, I'm pretty sure that this takes place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so next we have a question from the Coast Guard Academy. So specific to the Arctic, what is the most significant or growing technology industry used for national and international security? What is the goal and current progress of the industry?
Especially related to the Arctic? Was that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so what we see the development in the Arctic, and there are, of course, well, first I would like to say that the Arctic, as I would say NATO, has re-emerged as an important area for defense. During the Cold War, the Arctic was important, and a lot of, let's say, activities took place then for a while, and that also coincides, of course, with the end of the Cold War. It was the attention was not there anymore, and we now see a renewed, let's say, interest and importance of the Arctic region. So one thing that definitely will influence the Arctic is the climate change. It can open up new routes of course, trade, but also it can give access to, let's say, other resources than have been available before, simply because the ice is melting and retreating. Also, I would like to add that 5 of the 6 countries considered Arctic is now a member of NATO. And from the NATO perspective, we see increased interest in this area for defense and deterrence. Currently, we have some activities within our network, but by no means are these, let's say, fully and comprehensive. But I would like to point to one area that, well, has always been important, but we see now that is increased, and that's sensing, search, and surveillance in the Arctic. And there are different technologies that can help in this space, not least satellites, inexpensive satellites. We do see also the use of drones, of course. There is a world below the surface of the sea, autonomous underwater vehicles, new technologies for sensing, also in that domain will be of importance as we go forward. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. So I have taken some of the questions that have been asked and kind of compressed them into 2 buckets that I'm going to ask you about. The first one is a major source of and this is from Bertrand de Clare in the chat. A major source of inefficiency in the S&T competition is the fragmentation of NATO's R&D for sovereignty considerations. And he asks, are you seeing NATO countries becoming more collaborative in view of the context that you described? And this is related to one of the questions from the Coast Guard, or from one of the questions from another alumni, Bagu Skranowski. What were the benefits to the US from this cooperation program? We hear a lot about the US paying its oversized share and Europe lagging behind. So just kind of curious is how are the nations balancing their own kind of national interests with the larger NATO cooperation?
So again, thanks for an excellent question. Just starting with, let's say, the trend we see, and that's that, let's say, what NATO nations tell me now is that we would like, well, we invest more in defense. We will invest more in defense, science, and technology, and we would like to share more within the NATO framework than we have done before. And we need to do this in a more classified environment. So that's the main messaging coming from nations. But I fully agree with the term that, especially in Europe, because of, let's say, national, what can I say, limitations or what you would call it, it's not optimized. But I do see a real will, and hopefully this will be developed further within our community to share more. We can never expect all nations to share all information. That's not how it works. But we need to make an environment where nations feel safe to share more and collaborate more. So it's recognized. It's a cultural shift, so it will take time, but I definitely think we move in the right direction. And then to the question from the US, what you get back from this. And there, of course, the US is the largest contributor to NATO. It's also the largest contributor to the science and technology field. This is well recognized, respected. We now see in Europe that NATO nations invest significantly more in their defense. So I think the latest counting was that more than 20 at least are now above the target of 2% of GDP investment in defense, up from 3 or 4 10 years ago. We also see that they invest more in science and technology. I do think this slide up now also illustrates what you get back in the US. You get allies that are more capable than before, and also in niche areas. So, for instance, the naval strike missile and the joint strike missile here is something that, with your contribution, we are able now to hand back and offer to you into your arsenal. So I think the main things you get is the allies and also the niche world-class weapon systems that comes out of this for your own armed forces.
Thank you so much. Okay, so in the with respect to time, we actually have some really interesting questions in the chat about the divergence between geopolitical and strategic value in technology and academic freedom. Another one looks at the roles of robotics and autonomy. But I'm actually going to focus on 2 questions that were asked, or actually one question that was asked from the Coast Guard Academy as a way of kind of rounding out this discussion. So the Coast Guard Academy students ask, how can the US and NATO countries work to better inform the public of the importance of NATO science and technological development to create the same level of warranted concern and public awareness created by the Sputnik launch that you had talked about? So what are some ways that NATO can reach out and kind of inform the NATO publics about these endeavors and the need for them?
Okay, thanks again. That's a big question. Within NATO, we do have what's called the Public Diplomacy Division that are reaching out to nations, that are, let's say, communicating in the nations or to the nations. The way NATO works is that we can only provide, let's say, the material and the material, the information, the knowledge, and it will be, to a large extent, I would say, a national responsibility to bring this information into the different nations. NATO as an organization, or the NATO bureaucracy, is very careful not to, let's say, intervene in the nations themselves. So, for instance, when we produce results in our community, we offer them to specific points of contact in each nation, and it's the nation's own, let's say, responsibility how they would like to distribute this information internally in their nation. So to answer the question, I think the best thing we can do from our side is to prepare the types of material that kind of illustrates the points, and leave it to the nations to use it nationally. Second, I do think the initiatives we have now taken with summer schools for early career scientists and similar initiatives can also be helpful in the long run, because this is a mindset change, and it will take time. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. All right, now, Phil, I give it off to you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for such wonderful presentation and questions. I very much look forward to let me just get, yeah. So moving forward, thanks for staying a little bit over time wherever you're dialing in from. And let me thank the colleagues at SINTEF and Nurim from the Alumni Association, Frederick Wolfgang from the clubs in Northern Germany for helping supporting this process of looping all these lost alums together to bring these experiences and insights from the field to our discussion. And I hope that we can also look for opportunities to also to bring like classroom, say Abby's classroom from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy to create this new type of dynamics in the future session. So we are open to new ideas and collaboration methods. So please send us email, Olivia and I. You can find us easily at the website. I leave the QR code here on the screen. And stick with us for the rest of the season. We have the Abby Tinsa from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy coming up next week, October 9th, for a presentation. And then the schedule is in front of you. And then we might update this one along the way if we get interesting content coming in. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending. And for the panelists, can we just stay a few more minutes to do a wrap up after everybody leaves? Thanks.